Over to you, Dave.
Thank you very much. Just want to check, can everyone hear me okay? Great. Just a little bit of backstory to this talk. I gave a talk on dealing with irresponsibility for accessibility at the UX in the City conference in Oxford back in April. And I thought it was an interesting way to package up the challenge of accessibility as being something that quite often gets lumped on a single person or a group of people, and explore how we can share that burden more effectively. I did the talk again at short notice at UX Scotland. I just want to ask, was anybody at that talk who was in the audience here? Because that's helpful to know that none of you were there. This is a different session, but covering similar material. But for everyone here, hopefully it's something, it's a new perspective on a problem that you're maybe already trying to tackle and are looking at different approaches. Something I'd also like to sort of clarify based on Mike's introduction, the interactive aspect is I would like to learn a lot from what is happening at your places of work, whether you're in consultancy or you're part of a UX team or you're a dedicated accessibility person. I'm here to learn from you and hear your stories, hear your successes, your less than successful efforts at addressing accessibility as a component of UX. So I encourage you to listen and contribute your own stories as we go through the session. I am going to start the presentation, which is what's going on. We're having display problems. So I'm trying to advance my slides and not able to do so. Give me 1 second. Help. It's always the same. I don't know what's going on here. Well, I'm trying to launch the slideshow, and there's an issue with mirroring. I usually use this while I let somebody else fix it. I talk about the cognitive. When you're trying to argue accessibility as something, and people are saying, well, it only affects a few disabled people, and we don't have that many disabled people in our target audience. And you start to address the theory of temporary disability. And one of the classic examples of where cognitive impairment is significantly enhanced is when you're standing up to talk and you're trying to figure out why, with a combination of your presentation software and the operating system, why is the display not behaving as it should? And if I sat at home, I'd diagnose it in no time, and here I'm struggling. So, and this happened. Yeah, this probably happens far too often.
That's PowerPoint, right?
Yeah.
Technical disaster.
Yep.
How many UX people?
That's what will never get
It just looks like the screen's not refreshing, is that right? Well, we could try and find that on. That's it. Oh, hold on, something different. No.
Show maybe, and then start over.
Just restart it all.
Okay.
Promising.
Just get PC.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's a mirrored view.
Hey,
So
well done.
I knew you'd love that one.
So thank you all very much for coming along to my talk tonight on PowerPoint usability. Any questions? I'm going to start, before we start kind of swapping stories, I'd like to give a little bit of background on who I am and my view on this challenge. I worked for over 13 years in academia at Dundee University as an accessibility researcher, teacher, and consultant. We did a little bit of consultancy with internally across the campus and also to external clients. But for the last 3 and a bit years, I've worked for the Paciello Group, which is a dedicated digital accessibility agency headquartered in New Hampshire over in the US, but whose workforce consists of consultants scattered around the world. And I work from home in Northeast Fife. So it's a nice setup. I get to do my work from home, but I get to travel and do on-site work with clients. And that work varies. Sometimes it's accessibility audits. Sometimes it's user research with people with different disabilities or usability studies focusing on people with disabilities. Or we also do a strategic consultancy service whereby we help organizations understand their current state in terms of accessibility strategy and identify areas where they can improve that. So it's a very interesting and rewarding and often challenging job, but it's a very specific perspective of what's up with the organizations we work with and what they need to help them. And it's a different perspective to that which a lot of you here will have. My perspective so often is illustrated by the slide here, which is a snapshot of a spreadsheet of an accessibility audit. Show of hands, how many of you here conduct accessibility audits of live sites or apps or prototypes? So probably about maybe a third of you. So you may well be familiar with the idea that quite often this exercise ends up in documenting a heck of a lot of bad news. On the slide here has lots of red text. The word fail appears several times. It's bad news. It's not particularly encouraging to the people who are responsible for producing whatever the app or site was that was audited. And it's indicative of a process not being right, that we get to a stage where we're accessibility auditing and saying, here's a whole bunch of stuff that's wrong. It doesn't meet all of these success criteria of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines or whatever standard you're auditing against. And as it stands, people with different disabilities will find it difficult or impossible to use the site that was audited. So work needs to be done to fix it. That work may be done, but what's to stop those problems from happening the next project that the design development team works on? So auditing and repairing is a common way to address accessibility, but it's not exactly the most efficient way or effective because it focuses on providing mainly developers with things to do to fix what is already there. It also helps when we're thinking about the problems that putting the load, the responsibility for accessibility on one or two individuals has. In my work, I've come across a number of different personas, and I'd be interested to know, for those of you who are already active in accessibility in the audience here, whether any of these personas relate to you. One is the don't panic, what we're going to do project manager, who has a responsibility for accessibility, knows that for a given product or service, we need to be accessible, but we don't really know what that means or what to do about it. And what ends up happening is somebody making snap, rush decisions that are often uninformed, that might be very, very specific. We have to use Comic Sans because that's what the only font that people with dyslexia can read, or we're not allowed to do X, Y, or Z. And it's not a very effective way. It doesn't really provide a level of clarity that is needed on accessibility. Anyone relate to that, or have come across anyone who there's a couple of people nodding. So that persona is rooted in some form of reality. The other one is particularly common is the Rumpelstiltskin developer, the person who is expected to turn straw or whatever other word beginning with S you can think of into gold. They're handed designs that are absolutely impossible to code with accessibility in mind. Just do this, just make it accessible. And it's an impossible task. There are low contrast color schemes, there are incredibly complex widgets that will be almost impossible to understand if you're a screen reader user, and yet all of the responsibility is on the developer to turn these, sprinkle magic accessibility dust on these visual designs, on this complex information architecture that is going to cause all sorts of challenges. And another one that we find we encounter a lot is the accessibility Lorax. How many of you are Dr. Seuss fans here? A couple. So I had never read Dr. Seuss, and now I'm a huge fan, primarily because the Lorax, who speaks for the trees, but does anyone listen, is a great analogy for the accessibility specialist, the accessibility advocate who's there in a lot of organizations, who has read all the guidelines, who attends meetups like this, who has a lot of information ready to share and has the passion and the advocacy behind it, the arguments for why this is important, but has no voice. You know, this is great, but maybe in the next release, or yeah, well, you know, we've got more important things to spend our limited resources on. So you have somebody who has the skills and knowledge, but gradually may well become demotivated to do anything about it because nobody else is listening. So again, these another persona. Anyone own up to being that person, or feel like sometimes they're that person? Couple of tentative hands. You're not alone, and this discussion is to try and help spread awareness and identify tactics for sharing the burden. So the question for tonight's talk discussion is, how can we best distribute responsibility and authority? Because with responsibility, you need to have the authority to carry out that responsibility for accessibility. And again, just as a kind of straw poll of the audience, I'm going to be talking a little bit about not necessarily roles, but activity areas, given that different organizations may adopt different design approaches, and I'm here to learn a lot from the way that things are turned from idea into working code. How many of you, I mean, I guess I'm assuming because this is a UX meetup, most of you are self-identifying as UX designers or UI designers. How many of you would put yourselves in that bracket? Any of you in product management or project management? I mean, I know probably several of you put your hands up to everything we ask. How many developers are here? So we've got a few developers as well. Anyone in QA? Nobody. Anyone in senior management? One or two as well. So we've got a good cross-section of the areas that I'm going to be covering later on in the session. And the talk title comes from a book I read by a guy called Paul Kingsnorth, One No, Many Yeses. Anyone read that book? This is it came out about 10 years ago, and it was a commentary on sort of globalization and the sort of the way that people are formulating into groups to protest against the way that you know, economics and politics are aligning for particular objectives. And it kind of came out not long after No Logo by Naomi Klein. So I was reading a lot of that literature, and I borrowed it for the talk because I think it actually sums up quite well what I'm trying to share with you all, is that there's a single no here, that we will not deliver a digital product or service that hasn't taken into account the needs of disabled people. So that's the sort of fundamental. We're not going to let things pass unless we have at least considered the implications of our decision making on people with different disabilities. And many yeses mean that each part of a product team and beyond the product team that can influence accessibility does so in a positive way and embraces accessibility as a key quality. So different groups are all saying, yes, we will do our bit, and together we can achieve this objective of a more inclusively designed product or service. And for depending on organizational situation, philosophy, activity, makeup, whatever position in the market, where you are just now in terms of accessibility attitude is going to vary. But we believe that responsibility is part of something we call accessibility maturity. There are lots of maturity models out there that address different aspects of software quality, of process quality. By thinking about accessibility as something that can exist on a continuum, a maturity continuum, it can help us think about the effective ways to embrace and sort of deal with accessibility at a strategic level. Quite often in our continuum, a lot of people are looking at accessibility at the least mature level, where something's already produced and the accessibility strategy is to identify the problems with them and fix what we can before we launch. So this sort of audit and repair approach, which I've already argued is not a very effective way to deal with accessibility, because at the point that you're finding problems, they're at their most expensive to fix. And when you fix the code, you're not necessarily fixing the process that led to that code being the way it was. Moving along the continuum, we start to focus on user needs. So we're still looking at a stage of producing stuff and then finding out what's wrong with it. But rather than thinking about auditing from the perspective of compliance with a standard, we're thinking about user needs and tasks, completion, goal achievement. So we're asking the question, what's stopping somebody who uses a screen reader, or what's stopping somebody who can't use a mouse, or somebody who has low vision from being able to complete a business critical task? And once we know that, what can we do to fix it so that that person is able to complete that task? So the priority becomes people. So that's a slightly more mature way to think about accessibility. Further along the maturity continuum, we think about accessibility as something that you inject into different stages of the design process. We have an idea, we do some research to figure out what user needs are, what the requirements are, and then we start to prototype, evaluate, build up this process. We're beginning to think about accessibility in the design process rather than when we evaluate. And then at the most mature level of the design maturity continuum, and we took this, I have a link on the slide, ux4.us/mature-it. This is inspired by a rough design maturity continuum by Jess McMullen, which was addressing the role of design in an organization's approach to creating digital products or services. And the most mature stage of the design maturity continuum was integration. So thinking about accessibility along the same lines, accessibility is something that is driving inspiration and innovation. Thinking about extreme user needs is identifying new opportunities for new products or ways to significantly change thinking about how existing products or services are delivered. And there are plenty of arguments that suggest that thinking about disability as, if you like, a sort of extreme need to consider will allow you to anticipate and deal with other extreme situations that you might not have thought of. A classic example over the last 10 years or so has been the overlap between mobile first design and design for disability, where a small device, he says, shuffling into his pocket, a small device with a limited screen, limited interaction area is disabling any user to some extent, in that it is reducing my visual capability, it is reducing my physical ability to interact with the device, and therefore with other situations like potentially limited access to a network connection or limited data channels, we're having to deal with a number of different constraints, but people are doing that in very creative and thoughtful ways. And the overlap between designing for mobile and designing with accessibility in mind is significant enough that people found that if they were already designing with accessibility in mind, they were finding that interfaces were also working particularly well on mobile. And this quote from Tim Brown at IDEO: by concentrating solely on the bulge at the center of the bell curve, we're more likely to confirm what we already know than learn something new and surprising. And if we think about user needs and think about this sort of fictitious normal person as opposed to somebody with a disability, that's looking at the center of the bell curve in terms of capability. And capability is multi-dimensional, but if we sort of simplify it to a bell curve and think about a population that has no significant visual impairment or dexterity impairment or cognitive impairment, then we're losing the opportunity to move to the tail of the bell curve and think about people with more extreme needs and figuring out creatively how we address those needs. And when we do, we come up with solutions that work more effectively for everyone else. So that's my argument to suggest that accessibility doesn't just belong at the coding level or at the testing level, but we need to move right back to think about accessibility at user research at the sort of ideation stage. So this is where it gets more discursive. I want to talk, actually I want to drink some beer and get rid of this frog in my throat. This is the problem when you're working from home. You don't talk for hours. and you forget what it's like to need to keep your mouth refreshed when you're talking for a fair amount of time. But as I say, you guys are going to be doing a bit of talking. I've organized the next section of the session into different activities, and I kept wondering in my head what was the best order to arrange these activities. And I had it in a kind of traditional waterfall order of, do the research up front, identify the requirements, and then design and evaluate, and then code and test, and then we're done. And this time I've gone at it the other way around. I started with testing, because that's still where a lot of accessibility goes on. And nobody raised their hands as a QA tester. How many of you work closely with QA testing teams? And so here's where we get interactive. What kind of discussions do you have with your QA testing teams over accessibility?
Perhaps that format focus on the input, tabbing,
Right.
the order of tabbing maybe.
Right. So
But primarily is the focus. Where is the focus every time the user is accessing that part of the screen?
okay.
And then you highlight it in solutions.
So focus management, which is a really important attribute of accessibility. And how do you write tests for them, or do you ask them to write tests? How does the conversation go?
There are particular wireframes are being designed that highlight how that's going to look like if the focus is not going to be your input. And we give the order of
Right. So you're specifying what should happen, and they're testing whether that indeed happens. Right.
the letter. Yes.
And what happens when things go wrong?
They ask me for more info. So it is very particular project. So that was GPS following guidelines. So this means they have very high standards of how to pass back for
Right.
visibility. So if something goes wrong, it's just not passing visibility back to design review.
So when something goes wrong, it's passed back to design, to you to address. Okay. When you talk about focus management, are you considering the display of focus?
Yes.
So a test, so your QA tester is responsible for assuring that there's a visible display of focus.
Yeah, and if it's an error, whether that error is close enough, the proximity of the error to that
Right.
input and such. So this is part of the QA.
Okay.
And part of my responsibility to provide the test of the habit information.
So you write the tests.
I write the specification, the requirements, what they expect me to see, but not accidentally.
Okay, right.
Just for the sake of the stream, I'm going to get a microphone.
Yeah, good call. So yes, I mean, focus management is certainly something that, and keyboard interaction is something that QA testing should be focusing on for any piece of interactive content, certainly for a web-based application or software-based application. With mobile, you've got touch interaction and assuring that's logical and accessible. Also, you enter the grey area of people who are using external keyboards to interact with a mobile app, and the still kind of foggy situation over what is an effective way of dealing with that, but certainly making sure that QA testing includes, can somebody use our application effectively without using a mouse, is really important. So somebody else who talked about at the back there on liaising with QA testing teams.
In my team, we're just sort of setting up with the processes of how we're gonna deal with all the testing and stuff. But it's mostly about education. They don't even realise something that exists.
So you're educating your QA testing team that accessibility is something.
And the management.
Okay, so across the board,
Yeah.
right. Okay. Anyone else got stories to share on liaising with QA testing teams? Nope. Here's my slide that discusses some tactics that QA testers can adopt to ensure that they're taking on responsibility for accessibility. And one is to ensure that accessibility is tested as early as possible in the process. You know, as soon as you get some kind of working code for a particular component that might be reused across an application, test it as early as possible. You know, the cost of fixing things later on goes up and up. Another approach is to automate accessibility tests, that wherever there are tests that lend themselves to automation. There is an ongoing debate in accessibility over the relative merits of automated testing tools and manual inspection methods. But there are certain accessibility tests that are very effectively automated, and whether the automation value is doing things that humans aren't very good at, you know, picking up uses of ID attributes, for example, that are important to ensure that accessibility solutions operate as planned, or it's a question of scalability. Automation is not necessarily a bad thing if it can do something better than a human can. There are certainly many accessibility checks that require human interpretation, but there are some that can be automated, and they should be. So the success criteria of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines are written to allow testing to take place in what should be as an unambiguous way as possible. And Kevin will confirm or confirm that as best as possible. I think that the rule of thumb was something like 8 out of 10 accessibility specialists would agree that there was a particular success criterion had been met given a certain situation. But generally, these guidelines are written to support the process of testing. So adopting them and integrating them into the testing process is a natural step that QA testers can do. And we've already discussed the importance of keyboard operation and focus management. Other important things to test include ensuring that for any given user interface component, its name, its role, its current state or value is exposed in an accessible way so that an assistive technology can announce those to a user. And typically that's a combination of checking whether the code is present and confirming that it's read out by a screen reader, and that the information read out is accurate to every state of that user interface component. related to that are accessible notifications and updates. So if something changes in the particular screen or state that's been tested, is that change made available in an accessible way? Let's say that you try and submit a form and there are some errors, you've missed some fields that are required fields, or you've not formatted something properly, and there isn't a sort of guide to allow you to do that correctly. And an error message appears somewhere on the page to say, here are some problems, you should fix them. Are those provided in a way that somebody who can't see the page is notified and can find those error messages quickly without undue effort? Again, this is something that testing can pick up and assure or send back to be fixed. And another important thing that corresponds to a lot of problems that we find when we come to do our audits is, has semantic structure been appropriately applied? So visually, an interface might look like it has some text that behaves as a heading, a section heading. It's big and bold. It certainly looks like a heading. Is the underlying markup reflecting that semantic role? Is it identified in code as a heading? If not, it's a problem, and tests can help to identify that. Same with lists and tables and other structural components that help to provide meaning to assistive technologies for people who maybe can't see the visual or use visual clues to identify that structure. So that's QA testing. We've got a couple of developers in the room, and developers, we could almost jump past this because this tends to be where all of the burden gets placed in terms of accessibility. And I've given some answers here. So let's think about things that developers can do to take on responsibility for accessibility in an effective way. Any thoughts? Yes. Write semantic code. So I think that was on the slide, but I will pause, and yes, and David will hand out the microphone. Any other thoughts from a development perspective, taking responsibility for accessibility?
Modularize everything. Sorry, we were about to.
I thought I just repeat what they said.
Modularize everything. Well, I'm going to ask him to elaborate. So let's have the
I come from a framework perspective, particularly Zen framework. So I would never think of putting something on a web page, for example, without first of all modularizing, so whatever's coming in before that page is issued is dealt with.
Right.
It can only end up on the page as an accessible unit of content.
So when you say dealt with, how do you define dealt with?
Say again?
When you say dealt with.
Well, where's it coming from? Coming from a database,
Right.
a file. How's it getting processed before the manipulation of that processing content display? And so forms are a typical example. Forms are, I'm so fed up with this subject, I find it difficult to describe it without having swear words. But forms in particular are a pain.
Mhm.
Some years ago we all used to natter on about making sure IDs and that were in there, IDs and names, and now it's IDs and names and title and description and everything else you've got to have. Developing that over and over again without modularizing it is just plain daft. So that's an example from my point of view.
So there's a strong aspect of making the process of integrating accessibility into code more efficient and reusable. Is that?
It's by modularization, of course, it's always reusable. And modules are either small or large, modules and build modules. But yes, always has to be reused over time.
I think that aspect of making the process efficient and again checking at the earliest possible opportunity
Which
before.
affords unit testing,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
You can't really build modules properly without doing unit testing. Yes, which brings in headlines.
Sure. Any other thoughts from a development perspective? Good one here. Pass it the mic.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a developer's perspective, this whole area can sometimes be quite. Developers often tell me they feel quite out of their depth, you know, especially when it comes to using assistive technology. You know,
Right.
One thing I suggest is, you know, is that I think you mentioned before, sort of just taking the kind of mobile first approach, like a little bit step first, and sort of developing very simple semantic structure first, and sort of testing that, maybe even going through it on an iPhone or something like that, you know, and then going a bit easy on the divs, I think, you know, can really help as well.
Yeah, as you actually make a very good point about this came up in a recent the UX Scotland talk. This relationship of assistive technology to the development process, and there were logistical challenges of figuring out which assistive technology should I be using to test with. How do I know that my experience of it is a bona fide experience that somebody who uses an assistive technology all the time would have? And if I'm finding something wrong, is that really a problem, or is it more my incompetence with an AT? And then you give an answer, which is to use a mobile device. So for those of you with iPhones, you should know that the iPhone ships with a screen reader. VoiceOver is installed there. And taking some time to go through the VoiceOver tutorial and learn its key features, like using the rotor as a kind of like equivalent of a kind of a dial that allows you to adjust interaction with whatever app is running at the time, or system settings, you know, almost like, you know, twisting your fingers on this invisible, well, maybe invisible, this thing allows you to interact with a page or a screen in different ways, and that gets out of the, you know, that avoids all the discussion of having to buy a copy of JAWS, this market leading Windows screen reader at several £100 or whatever it is just now, or choosing which desktop system. There is a difference between answering the question, does it work on you know, when I fire up a screen reader, am I getting the information I need, and does it work on every single combination of screen reader, operating system and browser, and adapting the approach of, you know, supporting specific combinations is necessarily going to take more time and cause more of a debate over which one you choose. So you know, thinking about the one that already ships in your phone, which is used by a lot of people, is a good way to start. And then if you have a particular support matrix that requires you to go beyond that, that's when you start to identify the slight differences in the way that assistive technologies support standards, which is unfortunately the reality of the world we live in. You know, if it works in one, it doesn't necessarily work in everything, but that's because there are slight idiosyncrasies rather than a fundamental difference in the way things are supported. So I think the bottom line is, if you're testing using your phone, then you're going to get a pretty decent clue as to whether it's going to work across different assistive technologies and different platforms. So here are some more thoughts for from a development perspective, and this kind of spoke to the using semantic elements, prioritizing using native elements over relying on something like Way ARIA to polyfill accessibility. How many of you here are aware of Way ARIA as an accessibility solution? For those of you who don't, this is effectively a way to bridge the gap between HTML, as historically has been, and interactive web apps that use all sorts of clever scripting approaches and repurposing of usually semantically neutral HTML elements like divs and spans to create interactive user interfaces that allow you to do more, both from an interaction perspective and from a visual design perspective, than if you stuck to traditional HTML elements. That all said, if you have ARIA as a sort of this is the approach we're going to take without thinking about how it could be done using native elements, you may well find yourself addressing some challenges that are not easy to address. So always, I'm paraphrasing, but the first rule of ARIA is don't use ARIA when a native element could do the job just as effectively or more effectively. Focusing on device-independent interaction as a principle. This goes back to the idea that not everybody is going to use a mouse. So as a developer, if you're focusing on making sure that anything interactive can be operated using standard keyboard commands, you're going to tick a lot of accessibility boxes. Accepting that people need to have flexibility over how something is displayed, rather than trying to preserve a standard look and feel across every single platform, every single interaction situation. For people who need to pinch to zoom to be able to read content on a tablet or a mobile phone, that's an essential requirement, not a sort of nice to have. For people who have dyslexia and may need to adjust display, hard coding in certain color schemes or having images of text is a way to make sure that those display customizations don't work, and you basically stop people's ability to read comfortably. So accepting that display flexibility is a key component of accessibility allows you to move forward and avoid hard baking in more accessibility problems. Thinking about third-party content frameworks, players, whatever you bring in from outside, that in theory should help make the development job more efficient. Ask questions on accessibility. You know, how well does this framework support accessibility? What additional work are we going to have to do to fill in the gaps that the framework has left for us to fill in? And if that effort is significant, then maybe think about another framework. So again, the point to make is that these things are out there to help make the development job more efficient, more powerful. Make sure that that includes your accessibility efforts along with everything else. And as a developer, if you're being handed something to implement that has things that clearly look, we can't possibly do this in an accessible way, particularly from a visual design perspective, or there is some UI component, a carousel or something that just does not seem right and you know is going to cause you problems from an accessibility perspective, push it back. The process shouldn't allow you to be given something to implement that has clear accessibility problems, but wherever possible, push it back and say, we need to talk about this. This is going to cause accessibility problems. And you know, depending on where you work, you might say, well, that's not going to work. But you know, at least raising the issue rather than spending time trying to do something that may be difficult or impossible. Okay, so here we come to UX and UI design and responsibility for accessibility, which I guess addresses most of you in the audience. So it's passing the microphone around time again. Share your stories for how you ensure that accessibility informs your design and development work. I'm going to talk about research in a short while, so if we think about the sort of design stage, does anyone get any stories to share?
The first time that I worked with accessibility is actually showing a video before and after, had accessibility principles in place, and how the designer was thinking in different mind frame about how to design a wireframe product. It was extremely relevating to see, by probably wear glasses or using magnifiers, how a design that I worked with before looked and wasn't actually accessible. The stories I share from that point of view is we follow GDS guidelines a lot. It's a government project. GDS guidelines, which
right.
automatically have accessibility display.
Right.
So all the design patterns we are using for those wireframes.
So in the wireframing activity, you're being informed by third-party guidelines that you you followed, and you're also talking about making people aware of the impact of their work on somebody with a disability. That's so. And how successful is that?
Has been an innovation. I have worked on papers on accessibility after this project. I worked with the testers very close, and the developers very close to increase empathy about people with that need to have assistive technology. Fast, I have a bigger question about personas later on. It informs the way I work now and always. It has been an innovation since then. Is it correct? It's a bit of a challenge sometimes because you might see a new trend from a design point of view that cannot be accessible. But that gives you quite an exciting way of working around it. And make that be a modern website, a modern product, but also accessible. So that's very exciting times.
Just everyone here is aware of the GDS guidelines. I'm just assuming that, but is anyone in the government data service or digital service? It still exists, just. But they've done a lot of work in integrating accessibility into their UX process and getting away from a sort of defining accessibility as a technical set of checkpoints, but looking at the process of thinking about accessibility at every stage. So it's good to hear that. Any other stories or first-hand experiences of trying to deal with accessibility or concerns or things you want to know more about, but
I'm a designer, I'm an interaction designer. So for me, when I design a new product, I will double check everything that the pattern, the color, is readable from the website, and then make sure that at least gonna fit into the AAA rather than just 1A, like you initially you showing 1A. So for as designer, I will try to do more than the guidelines say, because I believe that if I design something which benefits for the people who need accessible, and then it will benefit for the rest of the people. So just like it's a building mind. Like when you design, you have to have that in mind. So that's just how I do it.
So when you say you're trying to meet the W3C like AAA conformance, is that something a personal decision, or is that something?
It's a personal decision. Like you said, all the products in my work environment, we have to fit in AA. Right. But for my personal preference, I like to be AAA. Right. So, and also when I do the quality control bit, then I also check. Sometimes the developer will be like, it's kind of time consuming for them to develop something which is accessible. But when we do the quality control, we have to check whether everything is going to be readable, accessible, and fitting what we design. So when I design like patterns, I will also state like different state, like folk state, and just try to be as detailed as possible, and then so that it's going to be passed on with like different process, and then everyone going to know this is going to be the guideline, and you have to follow this. So for me, I just like read more and then try to gain my personal knowledge and then try to pass, because the design is the first stage for a product. So that's how I do it.
When you design a pattern, is there a kind of standard template or format that you describe the pattern?
No,
I mean, you talked about some great stuff that is
so it's more
in
like
pattern definition.
So in the past, I designed, for example, how the data taker should behave,
right.
Like say for different people and under different circumstances or different devices. So I would define like what is gonna look initially, and then what is gonna look if you're using keyboard. What is gonna look when you hover over. What's gonna look when you interact. What's gonna look after you've done something. What's gonna look when there's error. So all those different status. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. No, that's good. Do other people go to the same level of depth as you do?
Well, because well, all the designers that I worked with, they kind of similar, because we share in similar understanding on that, similar mindset or philosophy, whatever you call it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Anyone else? I'll give my thoughts on things that the design process can take responsibility for accessibility. Defining colours. This is the place where you choose colour schemes that aren't going to cause problems from a contrast perspective, or reliance on the use of colour to convey information. If that decision is, if decision on how colour is being used is informed by accessibility at this stage, then you're not going to give developers the challenge of figuring out how to deal with low contrast colour schemes. Same with selection of fonts, the use of icons to convey information. Reliance on icons introduces challenges on how those icons, or the meaning provided by the icon, is provided in an accessible way. It's very easy to find a way to use icons in a way that makes it impossible for a screen reader user to know that they're there or what they mean. So raising that flag when icons are used to ensure that they're implemented in an accessible way when they are used is another way that responsibility can be flagged as early as possible. From an interaction design perspective, making sure that the appropriate patterns are selected for the corresponding interaction. The more complex the interaction, the more tricky the accessibility problems are going to be to solve, whether those problems are related to non-mouse interaction with the pattern, or conveying the current state of the interface and all the labeling challenges that go along with making sure that a complex user interface component is accessible to somebody who can't see it. And production of resources such as the description of patterns that is produced that have accessibility attributes included as standard. Anything that codifies what needs to be done if this thing is going to be implemented and reused. Style guides, annotated design artifacts that call out where accessibility will need to be attended to later on in the process. You can take certain responsibilities when you design some, a wireframe or some kind of visual mock-up, but when it comes to be implemented, there will be certain guidance that you need to pass on to the development team responsible. Ultimately, you want to be handing over designs that can be implemented accessibly. Another group to think about, anyone involved in content strategy here? 2 or 3, good. Any thoughts you have from a content strategist perspective on accessibility?
Again, part of GTS, you should be clear messaging. It'll be very clear messaging what probably an error or a header will look like. We're very keen on having short messages rather than a whole sentence describing one event. We're very keen having a verb and a noun part of the header, so a few list or something like that. I'm afraid I'm not a content designer. I wish we had someone who worked for this, but the basic principles of having something very clear and short and taking consideration perhaps cultural differences of what that message might mean to them is important to us.
So clarity and appropriateness for the target audience. This is where accessibility as a way to address the needs of people with, in this case, to a large extent, cognitive impairments, the effective ability to read and comprehend content. There's a very fuzzy line between a wider population's needs to ensure the content is unambiguous, clearly conveys a message that is appropriate to the target audience. You can look at accessibility guidelines, and especially when you look at the AAA guidelines within, or success criteria within WCAG, there's a lot more focus on clear writing that is appropriate and comprehensible. When you think about many different user groups who could benefit from simplicity, make it simple enough but not too simple, as people who are listening to content, or people who struggle to maybe have attention difficulties. So again, ensuring that content doesn't require excess concentration to figure out what is being meant. People who might have difficulty parsing sort of non-literal text, and people with autism who, if you're using a lot of analogy and metaphor and that may not necessarily be needed given the message you're trying to get over. I mean, we're not talking about sort of saying that all novels or poems are inaccessible, but there is an appropriate style of writing for the given audience. So again, thinking about appropriate language is a key aspect of where content strategists can have a lot to contribute to accessibility. Any other thoughts? Yeah, we've got one of them.
I'm not a content designer myself, but I work with a team who do it, and they build into their process to try and use sometimes external tools like to test the reading age, or things like smog testing they call it as well. But they're always asking me to try and help test if people can understand the content and find ways to get it in front of real users as well. But that's difficult.
That must have been a very tactful approach. It's like, we want to make this content really simple. Can you test it? But it's great that it's part of the process. And you're right that there are tools. I mean, Microsoft Word has a couple of readability tools, and you can debate the merits of both. But they will give a number that equate to approximate schooling, reading age in terms of years of schooling. Which gives a measure, and it could be integrated into a test or some kind of policy whereby all copy has to require no more than a certain reading age. And I think the GDS team have built that into their standards as well. So, yeah. A few thoughts I had as we talked about appropriate plain language. Consistency as well. There's a real importance in ensuring that there's a consistency in use of terminology across different screens, and appropriate use of terminology. One interesting exercise is to have a screen reader read out a phrase, and you'll pick up where most screen readers, as speech synthesis, technology that synthesizes speech based on a string of text, does it read, how does it deal with or apply heuristics effectively to a word that might mean different things depending on how you pronounce it? I think content is a great example. For those of you who have used or come across an accessibility hack, which is a skip to main content link, which is a direct keyboard shortcut from the start of the page to the start of the unique content within a page, allowing people who don't use a mouse to bypass all the navigation and ads or whatever at the top and down the side of the page. That link may well be read out as skip to main content or skip to content, depending on how the screen reader interprets the word. Is it an adjective or is it a noun? So a content strategist might be interested to learn how text-to-speech technology will read out a particular phrase. It may well be it's a one-off, it doesn't really matter, but if that phrase is being used regularly as a strap line or as a label for an important button, then you may want to think, how can we phrase this so it's unambiguous when it's read out by text-to-speech technology. Content strategists might be in charge of ensuring that alternative text is provided for every image in a page, and ensuring that alternative text is consistent every use of that image, unless the image is being used for different purposes on different pages. And we heard about labeling and instructions and error messages, making sure that those are present and that they're appropriate and again unambiguous. Labeling and error handling and notification form part of the web content accessibility guidelines, as well as being aspects of good usability more generally. And finally, for content strategy, content strategists may well be responsible for multimedia content, video, audio, animated content. So there's a whole focus on accessibility requirements of video content, captioning, audio description, presence of transcripts if captioning isn't available, transcripts for audio, ensuring that animations are implemented in a way that doesn't mean that there's excess movement that can't be controlled. There are accessibility requirements over flashing content that could be addressed at this stage before things go any further. And to sort of come right back to the ideation phase, let's think a little bit about user research and responsibility for accessibility. Anyone here involved in user research? How many of you have involved people with different disabilities in your user research? 3 or 4, which is good to hear. What was the purpose of that research? I'm just going to pick one.
Well, the 3Ds were there. The 3Ds were there to discover how people were really reading the page. That's Downs, dementia, and dyslexia.
Right.
For 3Ds. By and large, in those 3 categories, people will comprehend a page in more or less the same way, but at different speeds.
Right.
One can be dealt with, for instance, by providing PDFs, as you have links or show PDFs which explain something in particular. For dementia, there might be a good dementia day and a bad dementia day. We're thinking about how to cope with both, especially the early stages of dementia. Someone has been using websites in those stages and then suddenly finds that they're not quite as able to use them as they maybe once were. So, yes, listening to those people is profoundly important in developing both the pages and the content, and therefore the delivery systems. So
was your research question based on content you already had or ideas that you wanted to evaluate or compare?
No, it's putting things to them and then listening to what they have to say. A Downs person, for instance, might be very slow because by a certain age, Downs people have learned to understand that not everybody is up to their speed. So they're a bit reticent about coming forward. So you have to stop and listen and see what they're really thinking. A dementia person might be the other way around, depending on the day. And as for people with dyslexia, simply turning a big screen on end and seeing how the text comes out, it's not really much different from how it was in the first place, which can tell people like you and me an awful lot.
So is that a one-off activity or is it something that you would?
It's interactive, it's in-house with people rather than going out into the field and doing one studies of 7,000 subjects.
They're still getting the perspective from the user group that might otherwise have needs that are not understood and not taken into account.
There's lots of offer there.
So I'm going to sort of finish up in a moment or two, but this is what I like doing best, which is user research involving people with disabilities, and especially understanding a problem space from a disabled person's perspective. So figuring out what's the situation just now, how do you deal with this particular problem, what coping strategies do you adopt, what's the most important thing to tackle. Sometimes we can be well-meaning but misguided when we think about what problems need to be addressed when it comes to disability. So getting a first-hand perspective rather than assuming that I know what the problem is and I know how to fix it. And including disability in personas, in scenarios, in user stories, in design, again, in design artifacts that are going to be used to inform and keep people aware of user diversity through the design process. And again, that's not a gratuitous thing, but it's taking the research that you've done, the insights that you've learned, and integrating them into your personas, into the scenarios, into user stories. As somebody who uses a screen reader, I need blah, blah, blah. provide that, make that something that drives development. And of course, when we come to evaluation, disabled people can participate in usability evaluation as people, as potential users of a system, rather than just as subjects who use assistive technology. You know, sometimes, again, we can forget about the person behind the user, and people who use screen readers, people with dyslexia, people with significant physical impairments are customers or potential customers just like anyone else with needs and wants and opinions. So while you may get extra value from how the interplay of an assistive technology or a disability with the user experience, you're still going to get that customer experience that you would get from anyone else. I'm going to kind of finish up here with the final group, project and product management and responsibility for accessibility. And this is really the group of people that bring everything together, that oversee the process for ensuring that accessibility is considered appropriately by all of those who have responsibility for accessibility. For dealing with standards, making sure that there are standards there that people know of and follow, and those standards are appropriate. Ensuring there's a workable exception process. I mean, the reality is that there are situations where certain accessibility objectives cannot be met. What happens then? How do we deal with exceptions? What is that process? Making sure that process is defined and justified so that you are confident of every decision that you've made, even if that decision is not optimal for accessibility, that you document why you've made that decision. And communicating progress and best practice, so all knowledge is being shared and progress is being documented and shared both internally and externally. You know, there may well be a valuable role if the product or the project is producing a new release of a product that has a bad reputation for accessibility, then it may well be very advantageous to share public updates on how accessibility is being considered as part of this new release. And there are a bunch of other stakeholders that I kind of run beyond the scope of tonight's session, but senior management executives have a responsibility for accessibility too. They also have a significant authority for accessibility if they're ultimately, they have are at the top of the pile in terms of decision making. People involved in recruitment of staff and training of staff to make sure that your new hires have the requisite accessibility skills so that knowledge doesn't become an issue and that things just happen as you were explaining there. You just do stuff and you don't have people querying why it's being done. It's just something that people do. So really, accessibility is something that everyone can take a degree of shared responsibility for and authority, and the system needs to allow people to assert authority. We need this to be done. We can't sign this off until it has been through our process for accessibility quality assurance. Just a couple of things that you could do now if you are going back to your place of organisation thinking, well, gosh, that all sounds very utopian. What do we do now? One thing is to use the accessibility audit if you're commissioning or there is an accessibility audit that has been done or is going to be done on a product. Don't just use it to find out what's wrong with it, but try and use it to diagnose the root cause of the existence of barriers. Who is responsible for introducing this barrier, or what process led to this issue being present, and how can we improve that process? Communication, again, I've already mentioned as being something that's motivational. If the positive knowledge that something is being done, that there is support, there is resources available to take steps to address accessibility, then it becomes more achievable than something enormous that an organisation feels it simply isn't equipped to deal with. Standardise in solutions and share them. If you've found a good way of implementing a date picker that in an accessible way, tell everyone about it so that anyone else who's going out looking for a similar widget can be pointed to this example rather than find another one that doesn't work so well. building a network of accessibility points of contact helps you grow awareness, share skills, share knowledge, share stories in the way that we've been doing tonight, and using pilot projects to demonstrate the value of integrating accessibility. This is something that ultimately we're going to try and grow across an organization. It may well be too much to try and do it all in one go, but if there are small pilot projects that can be used to try out a more shared approach to accessibility, then they can be a very effective test bed, learn from what worked well, what didn't work, and then roll out that methodology more widely. A couple of useful resources to share. The W3C have an accessibility responsibility breakdown, which is a sort of matrix of different stakeholder groups and the corresponding web content accessibility guidelines that might be, or guidelines and success criteria that might be that best addressed by a particular group. And I'll close with a quote. When people feel successful taking baby steps, they often find themselves wanting to make big changes, including their environment. This is from BJ Fogg, who's done a lot of work in persuasive design, persuasive technology. And it's to try and reassure you that if accessibility seems like some enormous challenge that is going to be very hard to tackle, there's so much to do and we don't know where to start. Taking small baby steps, addressing one or two things, easy to address things, will lead to an environment where there's a greater desire to move forward and make bigger changes. If you want more, there's a conference coming up in less than a month in Edinburgh, 16 September, accessibility.scot, a day of accessibility talks. Kevin White, sitting at the front here, has everything you need to know about that conference. It's really cheap. It's very, very good value. So I thoroughly recommend you go to that. And some of you may have recently received an email inviting you to join an accessibility meetup in Edinburgh. I don't know a huge amount about it, but I signed up. So that's another social come professional network that is emerging, and it may well be a great place to come and learn more, share more stories, and just generally an opportunity to talk more about accessibility. Thank you very much for your participation. Hopefully, I talked for such a long time because I know that cold pizza tastes better than hot pizza. So go and eat it if there's any left. And if you get any more questions, I'll be sticking around for a bit. So thank you very much for your attention.